Good day. Today is Monday, 6th January 2025, Christmas Eve in the Russian Orthodox world. And of course, today is also the second day of Ukraine's offensive in Kursk region, or its counterattack in Kursk region. I'm not sure exactly how to describe this operation precisely. But in any event, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Ukrainians went on to the attack in the area to the northeast of Sudzha, basically along the road, the main road leading from Sudzha towards Kursk region. Well, not actually on the road, but a little to the west of it. Ukrainian armored columns trundled across a frozen landscape towards a hamlet known as Berdin, which you can just about find on the map. It's apparently a tiny place, the ultimate objective being a village called Bolshoye Soldatska, which the Ukrainians were attempting to capture. And yesterday, the Russians were circulating lots of footage of this attack, of Russian forces successfully repelling the attack. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the attack had been thwarted and that large numbers of Ukrainian troops and machines had been destroyed. Now, that was yesterday, and I said that it was difficult to get a clear picture of what was exactly was taking place, and I said that I thought it was likely that we would start to get a clearer picture today. And in fact, today there's been more reports of further Ukrainian attacks in the same general direction. However, the reports from the Russian side basically continue to tell the same story. The Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainian armored vehicles have been badly damaged by Russian drones, Russian infantry and artillery and mortar units. Russian helicopter gunships have also been active. There were reports yesterday that something like 20 armored vehicles had been destroyed. Today there's been more reports that still more armored vehicles have been destroyed. And anyway, the overall claims that the Russians are making as of the time of making of this program is that this offensive, if that is what it should be called, has been defeated, or at least has been halted, that the Ukrainians have not managed to break through and have certainly not been able to reach Bolshoye Soldatska or any of the other important places that they are said to be heading towards. Now, at this point, I'm going to just venture my own comment, which is that I question whether this can be called a counteroffensive at all. Firstly, yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense said that the original Ukrainian armored column that was heading towards the village of the hamlet, I should say, of Berdino, numbered 2 tanks, an engineering vehicle, and 12 armored personnel carriers. Presumably, I originally thought that they were most probably Bradleys, but I've heard that they were actually Strykers. So that this was the makeup of the original attack force that headed towards Berdino. Now, contrary to what was said yesterday on the Military Summary channel, the Russians not only claimed that they knocked out both of the tanks and the engineering vehicle, but they also knocked out, or claimed to have knocked out, 7 out of 12 of the armored personnel carriers. Now, yesterday, the Military Summary channel said that no, the Russians had not made any claims about knocked out personnel carriers. The Russian Defense Ministry, you read the report, it clearly says that 7 out of 12 of the armored vehicles, the armored personnel carriers, were knocked out. It's the kind of mistake all of us make. Nobody should hold it against the military summary channel. There is such an over flood of information coming from the Ukrainian battlefields that every one of us, myself absolutely included, gets things wrong of this kind. Nobody should take them up on minor details. The point I'm trying to make is that this is an attack which took place with 15 armoured vehicles, 2 tanks, 12 armoured personnel carriers, and an engineering vehicle. Is this an offensive? Can one actually refer to this as an offensive? The military summary channel today has made the absolutely correct and valid point that right across the contact line, the Russians conduct assaults on Ukrainian defense positions pretty much every day. The military summary channel homed in on the Siversk direction, but in fact there have been many other places. They regularly attack Ukrainian positions with at least as many armoured vehicles as this. This is just a standard attack. Moreover, no different from the kind of attacks that regularly take place every day in the Kursk area. The Ukrainians have conducted many counterattacks of this nature, local counterattacks of this kind, trying to push the Russians back here or advance there or do something like this. An attack force made up of 15 armoured vehicles is, in local terms, a strong attack force. It means that you're talking about perhaps 100 to 200 men thrown into battle. And that, tactically, on a small scale level, is a powerful attack. But is it actually an offensive? Well, I hardly think so. Now, as I said, there have been further attacks since, but they all seem to be roughly on the same sort of scale. So why are we calling this an offensive? Counterattacks, local counterattacks, possibly, but an offensive? That seems to me a wild overstatement of what is actually taking place. And at the moment, it is completely unclear to me whether the Ukrainians have actually captured Berdino. My own understanding is that they have not. That's how I read the Russian reports, but I might be wrong. But if they have captured it, it's apparently a tiny place, a small hamlet rather than a village, hardly a place of any great strategic importance. It would make really little difference, in fact no difference at all, in terms of the outcome of the war, whether, or indeed of the situation in Kursk region, if Berdino itself had been captured. Now, what is very strange about this whole affair is that despite the fact that this is an entirely local counterattack, both the Ukrainians and the Russians are treating it, are reporting on it as if it was something much bigger. The Ukrainians yesterday were full of all kinds of confident reports about how they were about to break through, about how they were on the attack again in Kursk region, about how a Russian general had been summoned by Putin and dispatched in a hurry to the spot to try to bring the crisis, the operational crisis, under control. Astoundingly, all of this was being reported yesterday in the British media. This about an attack involving, as I said, 15 armoured vehicles and about 200 men. And in a war where the armies on each side number in the hundreds of thousands. So the Ukrainians, busy spinning right through yesterday, claims that this was a huge Ukrainian offensive. And the Russians, remarkably, were doing the same thing. They too have been reporting, and I'm talking about the Russian Defense Ministry. They've been giving us blow-by-blow accounts of the battle. They published a report yesterday. They've published more follow-up reports today about how all the Ukrainian attacks had been repelled, about the hundreds of losses that the Ukrainians have suffered, about the failure of Ukrainian operations in Kursk region. Anyway, all of this we've been given huge amounts of information about. But really, does this really amount to a major offensive that is being successfully repelled? This is, by the way, I'm just going to read the report from the Russian Defense Ministry. In order to stop the Russian troops' offensive in Kursk direction, the enemy launched a counterattack by assault groups towards Bolshoye Soldatskoye. This is today's report, not yesterday. The attempt of the Ukrainian armed forces to break through was thwarted by the decisive actions of a group of forces north, supported by aviation and artillery. As a result of the fire damage, the enemy's main forces were neutralized on the outskirts of Berdino area, which could mean that they did enter Berdino, or perhaps not, who's to say. The Ukrainian losses amounted to more than 150 troops, 4 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 16 armoured fighting vehicles, and 1 counter-obstacle vehicle. So this, as I said, is being talked up as if we're talking about some major Ukrainian counterattack or offensive, when in fact there have been scores of these. Every day there are some of these going on right across the contact line. Moreover, as Deep State is pointing out, the Russians appear to have known about this operation in advance. Somehow or other, they seem to have worked out that the Ukrainians were going to attack, and were going to attack in precisely this area. DS, this is of course the Ukrainian mapping project, have been complaining that Spanish bloggers have already been writing about this, and in fact there's been lots of evidence that the Russians were ready. Now, the Military Summary Channel has spoken about the presence of Kamov 52 helicopter gunships in the area as an indication that the Russians are having difficulty repelling this attack. I think it's much more likely that the Russians knew about this attack in advance, had pre-positioned these very powerful helicopter gunships in preparation for the Ukrainians coming, and that is why the helicopter gunships were there. It's because the Russians had advanced notice of this attack. So, again, all the indications suggest that the Russians had some prior information that this attack was coming. Their drone forces were all ready. Again, contrary to some claims, the fact that the Russians are mostly using fiber optic drones to repel this attack is now absolutely standard from what I can tell in Kursk region. The Russians use radio-controlled fiber optic drones for attacks further behind the front lines, increasingly in Kursk region, and by the way, now increasingly in other places. On the contact line itself, they tend to use fiber optic drones precisely because they can't be jammed. So there is nothing surprising about the Russian tactics. It's just that they seem to have known that the Ukrainians were going to attack. Now, that all leads me to think that the Russians have very, very effective intelligence now on what the Ukrainians are going to do. I'm not going to speculate how they've obtained it, but of course, Russian drones are there all the time in the skies. They probably knew in advance. They not only knew in advance that the Ukrainians were going to launch an attack in this area, but they probably knew in advance that the Ukrainians were going to make a big show of this attack. And given that the attack was going to be repelled, they played along in order to enlarge the scale of what they will no doubt say is their victory. But then that brings us back to the ultimate question: what really is going on? Now, there is a possibility that this is all a diversionary operation, that there is going to be a Ukrainian attack, but that attack will come in some other place. Now, there's been many reports, many rumors over the last couple of weeks that the Ukrainians were thinking of launching an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, or perhaps another incursion into Russian territory, this time in Bryansk region. And, well, I would say that this morning the Russian Defense Ministry has published a report about the Ukrainians conducting more attacks, more air attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Going back to the Russian Defense Ministry, on 5th January, the Ukrainian military made another attempt to attack the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and Energodar by 8 fixed-wing drones. Air defense systems shot down all the drones. When one of the downed drones fell, it exploded and caught fire on the roof of the power plant's training center. There were no casualties or destruction at the station. The radiation situation is normal. The personnel of the plant continues to operate in a normal mode. Now, maybe, just possibly, who's to say, this seemingly unsuccessful drone attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is preparation for a bigger attack which might come. It's not impossible. And maybe forces are indeed being concentrated close to Bryansk region in Russia, and maybe there is going to be an invasion, an incursion of Bryansk region. Who knows? But for the record, for the moment, Ukrainian channels and social media platforms, which have been becoming increasingly disconsolate in their reporting of this operation, just say, they seem to be treating this operation in Kursk as if it is the great vaunted Ukrainian offensive we've been hearing so much about. In which case, this is all theatre. It is not a real offensive at all. Perhaps Ukraine is no longer in a position to conduct offensives. Rather, it is an attempt to create a media sensation out of a small counterattack in one particular place in order to reinforce the view in the West in advance of Trump's inauguration on the 20th of January that Ukraine continues to be strong, that it continues to defend itself effectively, that it still has the ability to conduct attacks. That, it seems to me, is at least a possible explanation. I don't think we can write off the alternative theory that this is indeed just a diversionary affair, One way or the other, given the upbeat mood of the Russians, who are bombarding us with footage of what is going on in the area of Berdino, showing knocked out Ukrainian vehicles, showing confident Russian drone operators, showing us all of those things, and the somewhat disconsolate reporting from the Ukrainians, it seems to me that the reality is that this relatively small counterattack by the Ukrainians appears to have been unsuccessful. Now, one particular individual in Ukraine appears to be absolutely furious about what has happened. And that person is the dissident Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya. Now, there again continues to be a great deal of discussion about Bezuglaya and her motives. Many continue to insist that Bezuglaya is a cat's paw of Zelensky's, that she's going out of her way to create trouble for the Ukrainian military in order basically to support Zelensky's position. It's possible, but my own personal view, based on the kind of things that Bezuglaya has been saying, given the increasingly barbed criticism that she's making of the political leadership as well, as she has made, by the way, in her latest statements, my own personal belief is that she is acting on her own and is doing so, by the way, very courageously. Anyway, Bezuglaya is absolutely furious about what is going on. She says that she now believes that Toretsk, Pakrovsk, Chasiv Yar, all of these places are going to fall. She says that the Ukrainian military commanders seem far more interested in putting on a show than in actually taking steps to defend Ukrainian positions. She says that the Ukrainian officers, the commanders, are doing this because they want to impress the political leadership, not because they have the true interests of Ukraine at heart. The generals need to show another forward advance to prove to the political leadership that they are irreplaceable and are perfectly managing the Ukrainian armed forces. To parasitize on the fleeting euphoria and hopes of the people, to continue to hold their positions and not change anything, to hide their crimes. Either the southern offensive in 2023 or the Kursk region in 2024. So basically what she's saying is that this is all smoke and mirrors. It's not real. What it's doing is it's again diverting attention from the places where the disaster is playing out, where Ukraine is now steadily losing the war, to pretend that Ukraine is still fighting, and on the part of the military leadership, to keep the politicians happy, to ensure that the politicians aren't too angry with what is happening and don't turn on the military leaders and basically act to discredit them and maybe to dismiss them. Well, there we are. That's Bezuglaya. I suspect that she's right, and I think that she would not be coming up with statements like this were it not for the fact that this, as I said, operation probably is just theatre, just smoke and mirrors and nothing more. Now, I have to add a word of caution. The Ukrainians have shown in the past that they have cards up their sleeves. Maybe it is a diversion. If so, I'm going to make a guess that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is more likely an objective than Bryansk region. Why the Ukrainians would want to advance into Bryansk region at this time, I cannot fathom. But certainly, if the Ukrainians were able to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, there might be some point in it. I'm not saying that they can, but I could perhaps just about understand the logic of an attempt to do so. But anyway, maybe this is a diversion. One can't for the moment discount it, but more likely it isn't. The indications as of now suggest it isn't, in which case this is another utterly pointless, completely worthless exercise in public relations, the price of which is paid in the lives of the unhappy soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, who are launched on this mission. Now, the paradox of all of this is that even as the Ukrainians press forward to attack tiny places like Berdino, as I said, a small hamlet, which I suspect until a few days ago you would not have been able to find on any of the usual maps of this part of Ukraine. Even as that is happening, the Russians are continuing with their own advance in Kursk region, their own much more powerful advance in Kursk region. And it is taking place in two directions. Firstly, the Russians appear to be continuing to advance towards the village of Malaya Lochnia, a village that has been constantly and bitterly fought over. And the Russians recently captured a village called Kruglenkoye, apparently to the west of Malaya Lochnia. And this morning there are reports that the Russians have captured a village called Leonidovo, which lies directly to the west of Malaya Lochnia, and which is within proximate distance of that village. So it's likely that there's going to be a Russian attack on Malaya Lochnia fairly soon. And by the way, this fighting, in which the Russians are advancing to Malaya Lochnia, is not that far from the place where the Ukrainians are attacking towards Berdino. Just saying. So that's one part of the Russian advance in Kursk region. And the Russians are also apparently busy still rolling up Ukrainian defenses immediately to the south of Sudzha itself. They're apparently within 2 kilometers of the center of Sudzha from the south, and there's speculation that at some point within the next few weeks, a major operation to capture Sudzha itself will begin. Well, who knows? It's not impossible. So the Russians continuing their advance in both places, a much more powerful advance by all reports than this counterattack towards Bolshaya Soldatskoye and to Berdino. Now, the military summary channel has described this as the Ukrainians trying to add an extra floor to a building whose basement is on fire. I think that is a pretty good description of what is going on at the moment in the Kursk battle. The Russian attacks in the area of Malaya Lochnia and of Sudzha are far more dangerous to the Ukrainians than this seemingly aimless attack towards Bolshaya Soldatskoye. It doesn't make any real military sense to attack towards Bolshaya Soldatskaya. If the Ukrainians want to defend their territory in this area at all, I would have thought that establishing stable fortified positions around Sudzha itself would be the logical thing to do. Better still, they can pull out. Because if you look again at a map of the Kursk pocket, with the Russians now apparently on the outskirts of Velykovo, with Malaya Lognia about to be attacked, with the Russians controlling Ruskaya Konopyelka and Cherkasskaya Konopyelka to the east of Sudzha, and having established positions to the south of Sudzha, with the Russians apparently now able to send FPV drones over the main highway up from Sumy region into Sudzha. And these, by the way, I should make clear, are radio-controlled FPV drones, with the Russians continuing to conduct Iskander missile attacks on Ukrainian positions in Sumy region, neighbouring Sumy region, inside Ukraine, and with the Russians clearly starting to deploy helicopter gunships in this area as well. And this morning there was a report, by the way, that the Russians dropped a Fab 3000 bomb on a Ukrainian position inside Sudzha itself. Well, it looks as if the situation in Sudzha is becoming extremely difficult and very precarious and very dangerous for the Ukrainian troops. And I would have thought that all military logic dictates not conducting a pointless attack towards Bolshaya Soldatskaya, a big village, but hardly a strategic point, and one that leads nowhere that the Ukrainians can reach anywhere. Rather than conduct an attack towards Bolshaya Soldatskaya, rather even than defend Sudzha, the best thing the Ukrainians can do is to start organizing a withdrawal now when weather conditions are apparently quite good, when the ground is hard, when there's apparently overcast skies, which restricts the effectiveness of the Russian Air Force and perhaps of the Russian drones, and which conceivably would make it easier for the Ukrainians to retreat whilst they still have a line to retreat through. But Zelensky and Syrsky probably most unlikely to do any of those wise things. Anyway, that's enough about this Ukrainian attack in Kursk region. If I have to be frank, so far, unless something unexpected or something dramatic happens, it seems to me that this counterattack, this Ukrainian counterattack, is not just a minor matter, but one which is drawing attention away from the real offensive which is taking place in Kursk region, which continues to be the Russian one, with the Russians now clearly closing in apparently overwhelming force on Sudzha itself. Anyway, that's not the big news on the battlefronts. The big news is elsewhere, and it continues to be southwest Donbas. And the Russian Defense Ministry this morning confirmed that Kurakhovo has now passed completely under Russian control. And this is the statement that was released today by the Russian Defense Ministry. In the course of active offensive operations, Group of Forces South completely liberated Kurakhovo, the largest settlement in the southwestern part of Donbas. In 10 years, the Kiev regime has turned it into a powerful fortified area with a developed network of pillboxes and underground communications. It is secured by a reservoir to the north, which significantly limited the maneuvering capabilities of the Russian assault units. To defend the populated area, the enemy pulled in large forces, including nationalists and foreign mercenaries, strengthening them with artillery and tanks. These included units of the elite 79th Air Assault Brigade and 46th Air Mobile Brigade, as well as the 5th Heavy Brigade, 33rd and 157th Mechanized Brigades. Now, these are all, I should say, elite brigades. These are not territorial defense units. They give us a picture of the Ukrainians concentrating some of their best troops and best brigades to defend Kurakhovo. And the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say, in total, the Ukrainian command concentrated 26 battalions with a total strength of over 15,000 troops to hold Kurakhovo. As a result of professional actions of the Russian troops during the liberation of Kurakhovo, the enemy lost 80% of its personnel, over 12,000 troops, and about 3,000 weapons and military hardware, including 40 tanks and other armoured vehicles. Now, I would say again that this figure of 12,000, which is, of course, the Russian Defense Ministry's figure, it's not confirmed by the Ukrainians or externally corroborated. It must be understood that it anyway includes dead and wounded. The Russian Defense Ministry is not saying the 12,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in Kurakhovo. 12,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded in Kurakhovo. 80% of the total personnel. I strongly suspect that most of them, a very high proportion of them, were killed and wounded during the escape across the cold fields, the cold, empty fields west of Kurakhovo, some of them apparently waterlogged in the cold nights with the Russian drones and search parties hunting for the Ukrainians as they fled from the territory of the thermal power station and the metallurgical plant in the same area, which, according to the Russian official TASS news agency, was the last location, the metallurgical plant, where the Ukrainians had been holding out. And then the report from the Russian Defense Ministry says during the 2 months of combat operations near Kurakhovo, the daily losses of the armed forces of Ukraine on average amounted to 150 to 180 servicemen killed and wounded. Capturing this important logistics settlement has significantly complicated the logistics support of the Ukrainian military in Donetsk direction, depriving the Kiev regime of the ability to shell peaceful residents in Donetsk, the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic, with artillery systems. And in fact, it's been now suggested that Donetsk city is out of range of pretty much all Ukrainian artillery and rocket systems, apart from HIMARS systems and long-range missiles or medium-range missiles like the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows, and the small diameter bombs, and those kind of things. And of course, Ukraine has only a limited quantity of those. And the report continues. After the capture of Kurakhovo, the Russian troops have reached an operational space. This will increase the pace of liberation of the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic. And that's perhaps the most important paragraph. The Russians are expecting that from this point onwards, the pace of advance is going to accelerate still further. And I should say that shortly after this report was published by the Russian Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry also reported that the village of Darchinskoye, located just west of Kurakhovo, has also been captured as a result of decisive actions by units of battle groups. Actually, it's a different Darchinskoye. I'll take that back. Anyway, the Russians expecting that they will be able to advance faster, further west from Kurakhovo. And they go on to say servicemen of the 5th and 110th Motorized Rifle Brigades particularly distinguished themselves, showing courage and heroism during the liberation of Kurakhovo. And there's also been congratulations to the Ukrainian troops who participated in this battle for Kurakhovo. The congratulations have been sent by the Russian Defense Minister Belousov. So the Russians have captured Kurakhovo. It is now official, and they claim that the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses. But more importantly, they're claiming that they have now achieved what is called operational space. In other words, that there are fewer defense lines or geographical obstacles, rivers and streams and forests that can slow down their advance. They have more secure and better lines of communication, roads and railways and that kind of thing. And Donetsk itself is now basically secure from the kind of sustained shelling that it has experienced continuously since the 2014 fighting. So from the Russian point of view, an important victory. And when the Russians talk about achieving operational space, obviously the first things that they will no doubt want to do is that they will want to clear the remaining Ukrainian defense positions south of Kurakhovo. The Ukrainians still have some control some villages south of Kurakhovo, along the Mokry Yali River. They will no doubt also aim fairly soon to break this remaining Ukrainian fortified position around the villages of Andreevka, Konstantinopol, Rozpil, these places. But the main Russian objective now, almost certainly in this area, is Velyka Novosilka. And interestingly, yesterday, even as the Russians were finally completing the last stages of the clear-up in Kurakhovo, immediately prior to the announcement of Kurakhovo's fall, news circulated that Russian drones were operating unimpeded, unchallenged, above Velyka Novosilka, and that they were dropping leaflets on the Ukrainian troops in Velyka Novosilka, informing them that they're surrounded and inviting them to surrender. Now, the Russians have done this in several battles. They did this, as I remember, during the battles of Mariupol, in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. They did this, I don't think they did this in Bakhmut, but they did do this in Avdiivka. And, of course, more recently, they did it in Ugledar. And usually, leafleting campaigns of this kind, inviting Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, take place before the final assault on the position where the Ukrainian soldiers are being leafleted. So it's likely that we're going to see an attack on Velyka Novosilka an attempt to clear this village within the next few hours or perhaps at most days. And frankly, I think that with the Russians in control of all of the major supply lines into Velyka Novosilka, I think that this village is likely also to fall fairly quickly. Now, there have been some reports that the Russians have been actually tightening their grip around Velyka Novosilka over the last couple of days, that they've been advancing towards another village called Novo-Ocheretuvatiye, which is located close to Novi Komar, which the Russians captured some weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, and which lies directly on the main northern supply road into Velyka Novosilka. My own view is that Velyka Novosilka is already essentially encircled, and that the attack, if it is one, or the bombardment perhaps more properly, of Novo-Ocheretuvatiye is preparation for a Russian assault on this village and other villages in this area, which will take place after Velyka Novosilka itself has fallen. So anyway, there we are. Most likely an attack against this particular village. Also, Ukrainian troops, no doubt, trying to flee from Velyka Novosilka once more against the cold, in some places swampy fields, probably mostly at night, hunted by the Russian drones and the Russian hunting parties. Again, it's difficult to imagine a more disturbing fate for whatever Ukrainian troops try to escape from Velyka Novosilka to avoid captivity, as they try to withdraw from across the fields and the dirt tracks to the northeast of this small town. Most probably within the next couple of days, as I said, the Battle of Velyka Novosilka will also have ended. And then, well, we will see what the Russians do. Because with the Russians advancing west from Selidovo, west from Kurakhovo, with Velyka Novosilka under their control, the Russians do have the option, should they choose, to advance towards the Dnieper, towards the great city of Zaporozhye, on the Dnieper, as I've discussed in previous programs. It will be a stunning blow for Ukraine if the Russians, against dispersed and fragmented opposition with no great fortified lines, face a Russian advance, a concerted Russian advance towards the Dnieper and the capture of Zaporozhye, one of their great industrial cities. So there we are. All of this is going on in this part of Donbas. There's other things happening elsewhere as well. The Russians have consolidated their control of Vozvyzhenka, east of Pokrovsk. It's not clear to me whether they have actually reached the main road, which lies just 3 kilometers to the north. My guess is they probably have done, actually, but there's so far been no reports on this. But I would be very surprised myself if by now Russian parties, reconnaissance groups, call them if you like, these sabotage and reconnaissance groups, have not already reached the road in a number of places and probably crossed it. But there are reports that the village of Yelizavetivka, immediately to the west of Vozvyzhenka, which actually lies closer to the road than Vozvyzhenka itself. The road loops up northwards when it goes west of Yelizavetivka and north of Vozhizhenka. Anyway, Yelizavetivka supposedly has already fallen to the Russians, and other places, Malinivka, Mirolyubivka, Novoekonomichne, probably likely to fall soon as well. And of course, I discussed already how the Russians are apparently on the outskirts of Kotlino, west of Pokrovsk. It seems to me that within the next few weeks, perhaps by the end of January, the Russians will have cut all the main supply roads into Pokrovsk, and the Ukrainians will again be left with the difficult choice of either trying to defend Pokrovsk and suffering terrible losses if they do, or retreating from Pokrovsk once again across the fields in winter using minor roads, and suffering appalling losses in the process, probably after a hard battle inside the town itself. So anyway, a disastrous picture, and it is important to stress again how terrible this picture for the Ukrainians in southwestern Donbas actually is. This has been, as I've discussed in many places, by far the biggest battle of the war. A battle extending from Ugledar in the south all the way north up to Pokrovsk itself. The Russians are now on the brink of winning this battle. The Ukrainian forces who were defending this area of southwestern Donbas, this strategically important area, have been battered and smashed. The Russians are closer to the Dnieper than they have ever been. Once Pokrovsk falls, there'll be very little left to stop them. There were reports this morning of Russian missile strikes on the important town of Pavlograd, further to the west, along the road from Pokrovsk, heading towards Dnipro. In summary, this is potentially a catastrophic situation, and it comes on top of the already pending fall of Toretsk, which the Russians are clearing. I would not be surprised if Toretsk is completely cleared of Ukrainian defenders next week. Chasiv Yar will probably fall fairly quickly after. The Russians are now west of the Oskol River. They've crossed the Oskol River, and they are located west of the Oskol River, positioned, in other words, to attack Kupiansk, both from the east and from the west, on each side of the Oskol River. And of course, if Kupiansk falls, the way opens up for a Russian advance towards Izium and Balakleya, and further south on the Zherebets River in the area of Terny. The Russians have established a rather tenuous bridgehead west of the Zherebets River as well. They can consolidate it and finally defeat Ukrainian attacks in Terny. The way is open for them to advance towards Liman as well. To repeat again, if all of these places fall, if Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Liman, ultimately Kupiansk, Kupiansk, Izium, and Balakleya, and perhaps Siversk all fall, then the position of the Ukrainian troops trying to defend themselves in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation will have become, in my opinion, unsustainable. They will not be able to defend themselves for very long. So, in this catastrophic situation, what do? You start an aimless, pointless diversion in Kursk region. You attack towards a village, Bolshaya Soldatska, which leads nowhere and achieves nothing. You sacrifice a couple more tanks and armoured vehicles, a couple more troops on this pointless expedition. No wonder Bezuglaya and other Ukrainians are absolutely furious. Well, I've discussed the military situation as I see it in some length in this program. Zelensky himself has given a mammoth interview to the US journalist Lex Friedman. I have to say, it was one of the most fawning interviews I've seen. Zelensky was repeatedly allowed to get away with claim after claim, which frankly he ought to be challenged about. I mean, he repeated again, he trotted out the story that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in return for what it thought was security guarantees in the form of the Budapest Memorandum. I've debunked this particular myth time and again. To repeat once more, Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons belonged to the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union collapsed as a result of various treaties and agreements which Ukraine was a participant in. The nuclear weapons all passed under Russian control. I would add that the Russians also inherited, again as part of the agreements that Ukraine was a party to, not just the nuclear weapons, but the debts of the Soviet Union. It took responsibility for the entire foreign debt that the Soviet Union had, so that Ukraine became independent with no international debt liabilities whatsoever. Just saying. So that was the agreement. That was the Budapest Memorandum. Has no real relevance to the question of Ukrainian nuclear weapons. This whole thing is, as I said, frankly a myth. It was agreed, the Budapest Memorandum was agreed in a geopolitical world which collapsed in 2014 as a result of the Maidan crisis, because it presupposed a situation where Ukraine would remain a neutral country, as it had already agreed and had enshrined, or supposedly enshrined, in its constitution. And of course, in 2008, it received an invitation to apply for NATO membership at the Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit. After the 2014 crisis, it changed its constitution to make NATO membership an objective, so that it ceased to be a neutral state any longer. The whole structure that had been agreed at the end of the Cold War, which was predicated on no further eastward expansion of NATO, had effectively collapsed, and the Budapest Memorandum had in effect become a dead letter. And it had nothing to do with Ukrainian nuclear weapons anyway. And Zelensky also said, he trotted out his version of events about the Minsk agreement. It wasn't he who failed to implement the Minsk agreement, it was Putin. Except, of course, as the Russians have never ceased to point out, And as anybody who reads the Minsk agreement can see, the Russians took on no obligations in the Minsk agreement, which was supposed to be a document for an internal settlement of the internal conflict inside Ukraine between the Ukrainian government and the people in Donbas, who the Ukrainians referred to, the Ukrainian government persists in calling the Donbas separatists. It was supposed to be an internal agreement leading to an agreement on a new constitution, new elections, and autonomy for Donbas, which, by their own admission, the Ukrainians never implemented. So, Zelensky said things here which a properly briefed journalist could have challenged him about, but of course that didn't happen over the course of this interview. Now, the thing that struck me about this is that apart from once again demonstrating the fact that Zelensky is a very manipulative politician, but then politicians are, and perhaps he shouldn't be criticised for that. The thing that struck me about this interview, again, is the way in which the interviewer treated him, basically letting him get away with all of these strongly contestable points, and apparently ignoring the fact that Zelensky at various times over the course of the interview again resorted to bad language, which, to repeat a point I've made already, does not go down well in Ukraine or Russia, however unobjectionable it might seem to people in the West. Russians, and I'm sure Ukrainians, do not like hearing their political leaders speak in that fashion. Zelensky's inability to wear a suit and tie and his language, his extremely coarse language, is going to harden opinion in Russia, not just amongst the political leadership, but amongst the wider public there, that he's simply not a person who can be reliably trusted in any kind of negotiation. Even if there's anyone left in Russia today in any position of importance who would be minded to trust him. Just saying. But the other thing that came across to me from this interview is, again, the utter sterility, the barrenness in ideas. Zelensky was essentially singing the same song he has been singing throughout the entire conflict and before. Give us more weapons. Give us more aid. We're fighting this war on your behalf. You should give us, therefore, everything that we want, and you should be prepared to give us even more than that. You should give us every bit of support, every molecule of support that you can give us. It's not our fault that we're not negotiating. It's Putin's fault. He doesn't want to negotiate. We might have passed a decree precluding us from negotiating. But again, the interview really didn't address that point at all, even though it's one the Russians repeatedly bring up. It's the same story from Zelensky. It's the same record played again and again and again. I have to say, I got no impression from this interview that Zelensky is genuinely interested in negotiations at all. He says he is, whilst giving his own account of previous dealings with the Russians, which, as I've said, is arguable to say the least. He pretends that it's not it's not him, but Putin, who doesn't want to negotiate, basically ignoring the legal restrictions he's placed on himself. He disregards his own statements that he's not really interested in negotiating with the Russians. When he talks about a diplomatic settlement, he means one in which the Western powers, and indeed the whole world, basically present the Russians with an ultimatum demanding their capitulation, which makes no sense at all at a point when the Russians look like they're going to win. There is nothing here that looks remotely to me like a negotiation strategy or a diplomatic strategy or any kind of strategy to turn the war round. It's just a rather manipulative attempt to persuade Donald Trump to go on doing that which the Biden administration was previously doing, to go on giving unlimited support to Ukraine, to continue to write out for Zelensky blank checks, which of course he's able to fill as and how he chooses. I am at a loss to understand why it is so difficult for people in the United States and for others to see this. Now, today I was reading another congressman, comments from another US congressman. I believe he's a Republican, but he's a Republican with fairly strong, if I'm going to say it, neocon positions. Anyway, he was again trotting out the old story that it would be a complete disaster for the United States if Ukraine went down to complete defeat. He acknowledged that President Trump is committed to achieving peace in Ukraine, but it's quite clear, reading this particular congressman's words, that the peace that this congressman wants is for a settlement of the war purely on American and Ukrainian terms. This at a time when the Russians are winning. Now, I absolutely do agree that if there is a military defeat, if there's a defeat of Ukraine at some point over the next year or so, it will be a defeat for the United States, a deeply embarrassing defeat for the United States. But more of the same is not going to reverse this trajectory of defeat. It's going to compound it. It's going to make the disaster, when it comes, even worse than it already is. Negotiating with the Russians now, however difficult that is, might just persuade the Russians to draw back and accept less than they can take in their own long-term interests. But not negotiating with the Russians or approaching the Russians with proposals which they are certain to reject, so that the war goes on with the same story of more weapons deliveries and more statements of support for Zelensky and all of those things. In other words, doing that which Zelensky demands. All that he's going to do is going to make the defeat even greater and poison the relationship between Russia and the United States even more, so that what more and more Americans are saying should be the objective, to withdraw the bulk of US forces from Europe so that they can be redeployed perhaps to East Asia to confront China, something of that kind. That becomes impossible because the overstretched superpower will find itself confronting a hostile Russia with an immensely powerful army located literally on NATO's western border. That ought to be avoiding that prospect ought to be what Western officials are now focused on trying to prevent, or at least if not Western officials, certainly American officials. But as we can see, Zelensky's not interested in going down that road, which might make some sense for him. But so far, it seems as if far too many Americans in positions of authority are still resistant to the idea that the time has come to tell Zelensky enough. Well, we will see whether Donald Trump, who has in the past expressed a different view, will have the strength, both personal and political, to tell Zelensky the no that he needs to hear. For the moment at least, Zelensky himself doesn't want to hear it, and it seems that neither do America's allies in Europe either. Now, 2 programs ago, I said I'd like to return to the topic of the gas issue, which I now do propose to do. Firstly, gas prices in Europe, unsurprisingly, have now risen. We were assured by the European Commission that that wouldn't happen after the cut-off of gas supplies across Ukraine, Russian gas supplies across Ukraine. But, of course, they have risen. Of course, it may be that this is a temporary blip. Quite possibly, gas prices could fall again. But the important thing to understand here is not whether gas prices might go up or down in any particular week. It's normal that they would. Rather, it is whether, when they do go down, they will go down to the level they would have gone down to if none of these decisions had been made. The point is that the decision to stop further gas flows across the pipelines from Ukraine have created another structural reason why gas prices in Europe, and by that I mean ultimately all energy prices in Europe, are from this point onwards going to be structurally higher than they would otherwise be, or than Europe's various industrial and economic competitors' prices will also be. Now, it's not widely understood that what the Europeans are now doing is that they're basically putting all their chips on liquefied natural gas. There is a phantom idea of a resurrection of the pipeline project from Qatar across Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, which could in theory supply pipeline gas to Europe if and when it is ever built. It's not clear that it can be built. Syria remains extremely unstable. Iraq too. What all of this discussion overlooks, however, is that it's far from clear to me that it is in Qatar's interest to build this pipeline. Back in 2009, when this pipeline was first proposed, it made a sort of sense. At that time, pipeline gas was the only show in town. So when the Europeans were looking to diversify their gas supplies, basically that meant looking to build pipelines for alternative gas from other places. And Algeria was one possibility, and there are in fact pipelines that sent gas to Europe from Algeria, though not in anything like the quantities that the Russian pipelines did. And of course pipelines from Norway also exist. But the main project, as I remember, in the early 2000s was the so-called Nabucco pipeline, which was supposed to cross the Caucasus and supply Europe with gas from Azerbaijan, except that Azerbaijan never had that much gas. And ultimately it was supposed to come from Iran, but the failure of the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009 basically put paid to that. So in 2009, after the Green Revolution in Iran failed, this alternative project to build the pipeline from Qatar was first floated. And the idea was that you'd get the pipeline and it would send the gas from Qatar and you wouldn't need Russian gas anymore. And it is indeed the case that Qatar does have enormous reserves of gas and could probably supply Europe with gas. But that was in 2009, 2010. Now, as is well known, Bashar al-Assad, at that time the president of Syria, was approached to agree to the building of this pipeline. According to myth, and it is a myth, he said no. He didn't actually, contrary to what many believe, exactly say no. He said possibly. And the reason he said possibly was because he had his own project, or rather he wanted to develop this particular project in his own way. He wanted Syria to become the main gas hub. The pipeline would go to Syria. That would be where all the gas from all sorts of places would be located. He called it, as I remember, the Four Seas Initiative. Turkey would effectively be cut out. Erdogan, as I remember, was furious about this. This was, in my opinion, the proximate factor that caused the previous friendship between Assad and Erdogan to collapse. It was the key reason why Erdogan turned against Assad when the insurrection against Assad began in 2011. But anyway, the point is, and this is all history now, the point is that in 2009, 10, 11, the project, the way to supply gas to Europe had to be through pipelines, because that was the way in which gas was supplied globally at that time. However, this changed from about 2010. And what happened in 2010 was, of course, that the shale revolution in the United States began to gain momentum, and the United States suddenly found itself in a position where it had surplus gas which it could itself export. How to do it, however, building pipelines from the United States to Europe, for example, or to Asia, would have been a Promethean task. Nobody has built a pipeline across a body of water as big as the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, anybody who knows anything about the ocean bed would know that this is probably a project too great even for the United States in its prime. So what happened after 2010, primarily in the United States, is that an old technology which had matured in the 1940s and which had previously occupied a niche role in the American gas industry since the mid-1960s, liquefied natural gas began to take center stage, because that was the only way in which the United States, in practical terms, could export gas. And the United States, step by step, with the Shale Revolution, began to develop LNG industries and LNG technology. And of course, it was projected, it was represented that this was a radical new technology, whereas in reality, of course, it was nothing of the sort. It's, as I said, the technology itself had been brought to maturity as far back as the 1940s, fact which many people, in my experience, don't know. And at that time, perhaps not coincidentally, the United States started to intensify its criticism of the Russian pipelines, which were providing cheap and reliable gas to Europe through the pipelines. The Russians could build pipelines to Europe because they are geographically contiguous to Europe. The United States, of course, is not. So, after 2010, a country like Qatar no longer was tied to pipelines. And in fact, after 2010, when, as a result of the Syrian civil war, the crisis in Syria developed, and it became clear that no pipeline would be built through Syria, at least for many years, the Qataris also began to invest heavily in liquefied natural gas. And the entire Qatari gas industry is now built around exporting liquefied natural gas. And that works very much to Qatar's advantage, because the advantage for a supplier, for a seller of liquefied natural gas, is that you can export your gas anywhere in the world. If you export gas via a pipeline, then you can only export it to the customers who are at the other end of the pipeline, by definition. Whereas if you can put your liquefied natural gas on a ship, you can export it anywhere where there is sea. So, Qatar switched and invested heavily in liquefied natural gas. Why would it be interested in going back on that now? Why would it want to go back to the technology and the industrial structure of the early 2000s? Why would it want a pipeline which would go through Saudi Arabia, with which Qatar has difficult relations? The two countries almost went to war about 6 years ago, just saying, through Jordan, which is politically unstable, through Syria, which is also unstable, through Turkey, where Erdogan is the kind of person who will extort the highest possible transit fees that he can. Why go through all of that when you can deal directly with your end customers and supply them by ship? I cannot understand, I cannot see any logical reason for Qatar to build this pipeline now. In fact, I'm confident that, well, if the subject is broached, they'll go through the motions, as Arab states regularly do, of mulling it and considering it, but ultimately they will probably say no, because doing so would reverse the entire pattern of development of Qatar's gas industry. It would make little sense to them now. And it would also come with significant geopolitical risks if any of the transit states, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, became unstable or unfriendly. The gas might stop. And then, of course, you can't shift pipelines around like you can ships. It becomes more difficult. Of course, liquefied natural gas is more expensive than pipeline gas. But why should that be a problem for the Emir of Qatar and his officials, when, of course, the difference is paid by the customer? So I don't think this pipeline is ever going to be built, putting aside the fact that the current state of Syria is too unstable to make it worthwhile, put aside the fact that there are question marks over Jordan as well, and indeed even Turkey. I don't really see how this works to Qatar's advantage. It made sense in 2009 and 2010, but we're in a different industry today, one based on LNG. What in fact is going to happen is that the global industry in gas is going to shift increasingly from pipelines to LNG. There will continue to be pipelines, principally from Russia to China, which will mean that the Chinese will get their gas at relatively low prices and will enjoy the benefits of stable supply. Perhaps there will also be pipelines to India, though I think this is less likely. Most gas in most places will be sent by ship in the form of LNG. The Americans wanted it that way. The Europeans should have resisted this because it makes no economic sense for them, but they went along with it. They ended the mutually beneficial trade in pipeline gas from Russia. They went for LNG. That means that most of the global market will now be in LNG, and that's how the gas will trade. And sooner or later, the two biggest exporters of gas, Qatar and Russia, which will of course both be LNG exporters, will come together, and they will do what all energy producers do, which is establish a cartel. In fact, the Qataris, as I remember, some years ago, actually suggested to the Russians that they work towards agreeing a OPEC-type cartel amongst gas exporters. Again, for the sellers, it makes sense. And just as the Saudis and the Russians together dominate the oil export market, so the Qataris and the Russians would in that way dominate the gas export market and would be able to shape prices. The Russians at that time said no, because from their point of view it made little sense, because they had already got long-term contracts with their European customers who were receiving pipeline gas through the pipelines. Those pipelines have now gone. That incentive no longer exists. Give it a year, give it 2, 3, 5, 10, and I personally expect a gas OPEC to emerge as well. The big losers will be the Europeans, who will have traded cheap, reliable pipeline gas from the Russians, with whom they would have had direct dealings, with LNG, expensive LNG, paid for at the prices set by the new cartel. Of course, the Americans will not join this cartel, but then bear in mind that American gas production is probably going to start to fall at some point once the shale revolution starts to run its course, in which case the United States will probably have sufficient gas for itself, at least for a while, but it might be less incentivized to export it. So I cannot see that this trade is going to benefit the Europeans at all. In the meantime, European countries are already paying more for their gas. Moldova is now in deep crisis. And in Transnistria, we're starting to see what is starting to look like the first moves towards a humanitarian catastrophe. Quite plausibly, Ukraine will follow. The whole thing seems to me a bizarre mess, one born of arrogance and frankly stupidity and single-minded loathing of the Russians, for which European energy consumers are going to pay an indefinite price. Well, that ends my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.